Okay, we're going to review. Let's go back into your notes. Hey, on the planned kidnapping of President Lincoln. We're just going to do a little question answer on that. So
Do they have
into
a
your
movie
notes.
on this?
What's that?
Do they have a movie on this?
I have a pretty good video, but we got to kind of get through first. Kind of off color a little bit about this assassination, yeah. Okay, so the planned kidnapping of President Lincoln. Let's go back to that in your notes. I'm going to ask a few questions. Now, can you tell me, please, Ms. Flores, where did John Wilkes Booth first maybe get the notion that he wanted to plan to kidnap Lincoln?
One of his speeches.
Very good. At one of his speeches at the White House, 2 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Okay? Now, as we mentioned, Booth was a Southern sympathizer. He didn't like anything that Lincoln stood for. He blamed Lincoln for all the South's problems. Someone, if I'm a Southern sympathizer, if you get in trouble and get a day of in-school suspension and I'm a Garrett sympathizer, I'm going to go and I'm going to be in saying, you know, geez, that was a bad deal for you. They cheated you, man. You were innocent. I'm sympathetic with you. So for the South, he was a Southern sympathizer. Yeah. Well, when was it, Susanna, please, an approximate date of when Booth began to develop his plan to kidnap Lincoln?
Was it January?
No, that's when he organized it, but when did he first start thinking about it?
Late summer, 1864.
Very good, late summer of 1864. And his plan was to do what, Josh? What was he going to do? What was his plan as far as the kidnapping? He was going to kidnap Lincoln and do what?
Ransom him for money and prisoners from Southern prison.
Okay, and where was he going to take him, Andrew, after he kidnapped him to ransom him? Richmond. Okay, now, give me one of the, yes.
Why did they want, like, didn't the prisoners of war from the South get released after the war? Why not?
No, there was a lot of issues there. You know, one thing we didn't go into too much with the Civil War is just because Lee, I think I told you this, but just because Lee surrendered at Appomattox doesn't mean the war, like everybody just quit right there. There were Southerners that didn't want to quit. If you ever watched the movie Outlaw Josie Wales, which is obviously a fictional movie, but that was his whole point. He and the people he ran with just weren't willing to give up. You know what I mean? Okay, so Ben, give me one of the co-conspirators that worked with Booth, that he organized them in January of 1865. Who was? Give me one of his co-conspirators.
Samuel.
Okay, give me another one, Mauricio.
John Surratt.
Very good. How about another one, Isabel?
I don't know.
You don't know because you weren't here.
Yeah.
Okay, Garrett. How about another one, Chloe?
David Hill.
David Harold. Got another one, Jacob?
Michael, whatever that is.
Well, I want to hear it.
O'Laughlin.
O'Laughlin. Pretty close. How about another one there, Christina?
George Atzel.
Atzerodt. Yeah, Atzerodt and Lewis Powell. Okay, those were the originals. However, Booth met and kind of threw another guy into the mix. Who was that, Garrett?
There was a, his last name was Stewart.
That's wrong.
No, not yet. Who did Booth meet and kind of throw into his group? Caleb?
Samuel Mudd.
Samuel Mudd, who was a doctor, and he'll come back into play in today's lecture. And where did they meet? Where did they meet, Chance, to talk about this plan to kidnap the president? Go ahead. That's right, and it was kind of a tavern boarding house. Okay? Now, remember on March 17th, 1865, this is when the group planned to kidnap the president because he was supposed to attend a play in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Lincoln changed his plan, didn't go to the play, ruined Booth's plot. He got upset, and it was at that point when he changed his mode from a kidnapping to an assassination. Okay? What was the name of the play that President Lincoln was going to go see on April 14th, 1865 with his wife and 16 guests? Yes.
Our American cousin.
Our American Cousin. And who were two of the most influential of his guests? Wade?
General Grant, his wife.
Right. And so most of those people canceled, remember, for different reasons. So who were the only people that joined the president, Mauricio, and his wife? Who were the two that actually joined him that night?
Major Henry and Clara Harris.
Okay, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris. Okay? Remember, who was the person that was supposed to be guarding Lincoln, AD?
Oh, John Parker,
And what was his position? What was he?
just a guard. The president.
But he had a specific job. He was a member of what?
Oh, the Washington Police.
Very good. So the president arrives at Ford's Theater about 8:30 p.m. What time, Christina, does John Wilkes Booth arrive?
9:30.
9:30. And Chloe, what does he do after he arrives and kind of looks things over?
He then leaves for the rest of them to get a drink.
He went over to a tavern, saloon for a drink. And who did he ask to hold his horse, Josh?
Oh, I was gonna ask if John Parker lost his job.
No?
You know, it seems like something you could do.
You would. You would. But who did he ask to hold his horse?
Joseph Burrow.
Right, Joseph Burroughs was just a kid that worked at Ford's Theater. So what time did he get back to Ford's Theater after having a couple drinks, Santos?
10:07.
10:07. And why did he have an eat? Why wasn't anybody suspicious of him, Wade?
He's an actor.
Famous actor himself. So he actually walked up to the presidential booth. I think I told you he looked into a little hole that had been carved through the door, walked up behind Lincoln, opened the door, walked up behind Lincoln, put this small one-shot derringer right behind the back of his head, pull the trigger. Okay? What did Major Rathbone do at that point? Okay, and what did Booth do? Slashed him with his knife because he had a hunting knife. Okay, then what did Booth do? What did he do then, Ben?
He broke his leg
How did he do that?
from jumping on the stage.
He jumped on the stage, which was quite a distance, broke his leg, yelled some quote that we won't worry about. He mounted his horse and rode off. Okay, and he left behind a mortally wounded president. Where did they take the president, Hannah?
Across the street.
To what?
The Peterson house.
Peterson House.
The Peterson house. And he died at 7:22 a.m. the next morning. Okay? That's kind of where we stopped, right? Okay, now Andrew, and I complimented Mrs. Vickers today. Mrs. Vickers is a wonderful lady, but she gets a little nervous. You know, it's her first year teaching, and she's kind of wondering if we're kind of on the same page. And I told her that you already knew about what we were going to talk about today. That's how good a teacher she was.
Question.
So that was it, yeah.
What's the Kirkwood house?
I'm going to get to that. We haven't got there yet.
Open to, well,
Okay? Why?
since it's a little higher up on
On the chain.
the.
Okay, so let's keep going. Now, the assassination of President Lincoln wasn't the only thing that Booth and his co-conspirators were planning that night. They were actually trying to overthrow the government as well. So they made a plan not only to assassinate President Lincoln, but to try to overthrow the government. So what happened is George Atzerodt, okay, one of Booth's co-conspirators, he had an assignment. And he was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at Johnson's residence at the Kirkwood House. Okay, that's where Johnson lived. So this was more than just the assassination of President Lincoln. This was the overthrowing of the government. And so Booth assigned co-conspirator George Atzerodt. He was to go to the Kirkwood House in Washington where Vice President Andrew Johnson was living, and he was to kill him. Okay? Well, Atzerodt lost his nerve and went and got drunk instead. True story. Lost his nerve and went and got drunk. Okay? Atzerodt lost his nerve, went and got drunk.
Wait, who was he supposed to kill?
He's supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, right here. Okay?
So wait, is Booth the only one that actually went through with this plan?
Well, we'll talk about it. We're not done yet. You guys are pretty good, Okay, now, you remember Lewis Powell, one of his co-conspirators. Who would probably be the next important person to kill other than the president and the vice president? Secretary of State. Anybody want to know who the Secretary of State was? Want to guess? We've talked about him. William Seward. No, no. Good guess. William Seward.
He's in like every election.
William Seward. And Lewis Powell was assigned to kill Secretary of State Seward. And David Harold was to help him. So another part of the plan is that Lewis Powell was assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward, and he was to take David Harold with him. Now Powell had a little more guts, so to speak, than Atzerodt, because after arriving at the secretary's residence, Powell wreaked bloody havoc. He slashed Seward and his family with his knife and left wounds on those people that disfigured them for life, but did not kill them. He thought he probably would have, but didn't. So Powell slashed Seward and his family with his knife, left wounds that disfigured them for life, but didn't kill them. Left before. Is that kind of story you got?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Now, if you talk to historians about this, if Booth kills Lincoln, Atzerodt kills Johnson, and Powell kills Secretary of State William Seward, historians will tell you that they certainly would have left the government in chaos. They might not have overthrown it, but they would have certainly left the government in chaos. Can you imagine that? Top three people, so to speak? Okay, but in presidential succession, just to clear this up, if something happens to the president, who's the new president? Okay, what happens if something happens to both of them? No, a lot of people think Secretary of State is actually the Speaker of the House becomes the next president. We had a little, I'll go a little forward in history. We had a little snafu on that in the 80s. When President Ronald Reagan was shot, the Vice President, George H. Bush, was kind of out of the country or whatever, and Alexander Haig was the Secretary of State, and he said publicly that he's in charge now. The Secretary of State screwed up the order of succession. That makes you look kind of dumb. But anyway, that was a big controversy because he really wasn't the next man in control. It would have been the Speaker of the House. So it's not the Secretary of State, it's Speaker of the House. Okay? All right. Let's talk about the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Obviously, we go back. He's jumped off the stage. He's took off. His co-conspirators have been somewhat successful in their attempt to overthrow the government, but not totally successful. And now the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth occurs. Here's what Booth did. After he shot President Lincoln and abandoned Ford's Theater, he crossed the Potomac River. And when you cross the Potomac River, you leave Washington, D.C. into Virginia, Maryland, etc. Okay? So Booth crosses the Potomac River and leaves Washington, D.C. Well, there was, yeah. Well, what Booth did is he met up with David Harold just a few miles south of the nation's capital, but he was in Maryland because they were across the river. So Booth meets up with David Harold south of our capital in Maryland because he's on the other side of the Potomac, so he's out of Washington, D.C., and he's in Maryland. So Booth leaves Ford's Theater, he crosses the Potomac River, he leaves Washington, D.C., and he meets up with David Harold just a few miles south of the Capitol building, which actually was in Maryland. And they went back to the tavern owned by
that one lady.
Mary Surratt. So they went back to the tavern that was owned by Mary Surratt. Remember, they had a lot of meetings there in the past when they were planning all this. They stay there a while, and as they leave the tavern, Booth actually tells the bartender that he killed Abraham Lincoln. He told him, confessed to it, said, "I did." So as he's leaving the tavern, he tells the bartender that he killed President Lincoln.
That's not
Fairly
fair.
stupid.
Nice.
Well, you can imagine back in Washington the chaos, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who said now he belongs to the ages, he ordered the manhunt for Booth, and they offered a $100,000 reward, which at that time was a lot of money, probably $10 million today. Okay, so they offered a $100,000 reward for anyone that would capture John Wilkes Booth and bring him to him.
Who was the one?
Secretary of State, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And And he's the guy that said in the, now he belongs to the Aegis.
It was 100,000.
$100,000 reward, that was a lot of money in those days, probably 10 million today if you think about it. Okay? Well, within an hour of the assassination, within an hour of the death of the president, soldiers, law enforcement officials, and even angry mobs looking for a little cash combed the countryside in search of Booth. So within just hours of Lincoln's death, you had soldiers, you had law enforcement officers, and even angry mobs, people in general that were looking for Booth.
So, if like a mob found him, would they like divided up the money?
Who knows? Somebody would have had to claim it. They probably would split it, I'm guessing. Okay, well, guess where Booth and Harold ended up? Because what's Booth's problem?
Drinking and like.
A broken leg.
Oh.
So where'd they end up? Andrew, do you remember?
The hospital.
They went to some guy's house, probably a doctor's house. How about Dr. Samuel Mudd? So they ended up at Dr. Samuel Mudd's house because Booth needed treatment for his broken leg. So he actually went to the tavern with a broken leg. Had a couple drinks, headed out, and went to Dr. Samuel Mudd's home. And Mudd placed a splint on Booth's leg right in the middle of the night.
Do you think that if he didn't break his leg, he would have got away?
He sure could have. I mean, I don't know how smart he was. We'll tell you where he went. He might have. That's, he sure could have.
Obviously not too smart. I mean, he told that bartender.
Yeah. But this was different, I think, and Hoyt has a good point. I think it would be more difficult to hide today than it probably would have been then. Okay? So after he leaves Mudd's house, who placed a splint on his leg, for 6 days, Booth and Harold camped out in a wooded swamp area in Maryland. For 6 days, they hid out, camped out in a swampy area, trying to stay away from being caught. So for 6 days, Booth and Harold camped out in a wooded swamp in Maryland.
It would have been hanged if he was caught, right?
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll see. Well, 9 days after the assassination, Booth and Harold finally crossed into Confederate territory in Virginia. So they hid out for 6 days in Maryland, in a swampy wooded area. Yep, and then 9 days after the assassination, they crossed into Confederate territory into Virginia. Remember, Maryland was a border state during the Civil War, okay? Well, finally, on April 24th, 1865, 10 days after the assassination, Booth and Harold arrived at a farm. On April 24th, 1865, Booth and Harold arrived at a farm. The farm was owned by Richard Garrett, who was again a Southern sympathizer. So Booth and Harold arrived at a farm which is owned by Richard Garrett, who was also a Southern sympathizer. And Booth and Harold went and hid out in the barn on the farm. Okay, they went into the barn and hid out, excuse me.
Garrett ratted him out.
Nope. Well, the next morning, early in the morning, just at the light of day, when it became to be daylight, Union military forces from the 16th New York Cavalry found Booth and Harold in the barn. Knew they were in there. So the very next morning, which would have been April 25th, at the very light of day, just as it got light, Booth and Harold were cornered in that barn by Union military forces from the 16th New York Cavalry. They had military people looking after them, law enforcement, regular people, and it was the Union 16th Army, or Cavalry from New York that cornered them.
So nobody got the money.
If the military, that's right, military is doing your job. Yeah. Well, Harold was smart enough he just immediately walked out and surrendered. Harold just immediately surrendered. Okay, walked right out. Booth refused. but they had orders to take Booth alive. That was the orders. So Harold can see that this isn't gonna work too well for him, and so he chooses to surrender immediately, and Booth refuses. But remember that the cavalry, the Union orders were to take Booth alive. So what do they do to try to get him out of there?
Shoot the other man.
Well, they don't want to shoot at him because they don't, they're not inside the barn. What do they do? Set the barn on fire, thinking that'll get him out. Well, we'll see.
Didn't die.
So they start the barn on fire to hope to get him out.
This seems pretty excessive for one guy, and then it's just ruining this guy's barn.
Yeah. Well, even though the troops had orders to take Booth alive, when Booth showed his face because the barn was on fire, Union Sergeant Boston Corbett silenced Booth for life, shot him, killed him. So even though Boston Corbett, I think Corbett, you think he's on your sheet, isn't he?
Yeah.
So even though they were given orders to keep Booth alive, bring him back alive, when Booth showed his face when the barn was on fire and he couldn't take it anymore, Sergeant Boston Corbett silenced Booth for life, shot him and killed him.
Why?
Well, they actually shot him. He didn't die instantly. They actually dragged him from the barn and laid him on the porch of the Garrett's house, and he died on the porch from that gunshot wound at the age of 26. Okay? So the soldiers dragged the mortally wounded Booth from the barn. They laid him on the porch of the Garrett house, and he died right there on that porch from the gunshot at the age of 26.
Old beer.
Okay, so Booth isn't going to face any punishment because he's dead. But the other conspirators within days were all arrested by the government. Okay, so within days after Booth's capture, they arrested these other co-conspirators. And they put them on trial.
Even Samuel.
Who tried them?
The
Secretary.
executioner.
Military, which was kind of interesting. It was a military trial. So it wasn't like a courtroom trial like you see today. They were tried by the military. So they were brought in and arrested. They were tried by the military,
Was that a little?
and they were found guilty. Okay, on July 7, 1865, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Lewis Powell were all hanged in a public display to make examples of. On July 7th, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Lewis Powell were hanged in a public display to make examples. Guess who else they hung?
Who?
Mary Surratt.
Really?
Hung her to make an example of her. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Mary Surratt was the first woman in history ever hanged. Mary Surratt. And there was a little controversy over that. And her trial turned into a movie that we're going to watch called, anybody know?
Very Sirac.
The Conspirator.
The conspirator.
And I'll just give you a little preview. They couldn't find any lawyer that wanted to defend her. I mean, seriously, can you imagine? That would have been difficult for Lee Harvey Oswald as well. Would you want to be the lawyer that defended the guy that shot the President of the United States? I mean, think about it, in those days. Well, that didn't happen because Oswald was the same as Booth. He was killed before he went to trial. But anyway, they couldn't find anybody who wanted to defend her. And so we had this trial. It's a great story, and I'm gonna show it to you because I think it's worth seeing. Okay? But anyway, Mary Surratt was hung with Atzerodt, Harold, and Powell, right in public to make an example of them for the
What
assassination.
about the other Sherrod dude?
Now, here's one kind of interesting note. Lewis Powell had a real thick neck, kind of a thick-built guy. You can see him in the picture. His neck didn't snap when they dropped him, and it took him 8 minutes to die. Can you imagine watching that flopping around? Seriously, no, true story. True story. He had a thick neck, And when they dropped him, his neck didn't break or snap, and he basically took him 8 minutes to choke to death.
Dude.
That was Lewis Powell.
That would be
You see a picture of
bummer.
Lewis Powell?
I would be so
Pretty thick
mad.
neck.
Like if I was hanging there, I'd be like,
Like, why did I have to get ripped?
Now, who's that lead left? Look at your
Laughlin.
list.
Laughlin.
Michael O'Loughlin.
John
We didn't mention too much about him, did we?
John Surratt.
Okay, not, got these John Surratt, who else?
But
Samuel Arnold
Samuel Mudd.
But,
and Samuel Mudd. Did I say, no, who's the Arnold?
yeah, Samuel Arnold.
Yeah,
and Samuel
Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Loughlin,
John Surratt.
and John Surratt. Okay, here's what happened to those guys. Mudd, who basically what he did is treat Oswald's leg, that's really what he did. He and Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin, who had, I guess, minor roles, were given life terms in prison.
Oh.
Life terms in prison.
Yeah, you said
Wait, what happened to it?
Oswald's leg.
Huh? Did I say Oswald?
Yeah.
Sorry.
What happened to Mudd now?
He and Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin were sentenced to life in prison.
Wasn't Mudd just doing a job though? Wasn't he a doctor?
Yeah,
Definitely
but that's not how they looked at it. You're helping the guy that assassinated President Lincoln. It was controversial.
But the soldiers didn't get paid.
Well, it was controversial, but they gave him a life sentence. Now, who does that leave? Who does that leave, kids?
John Surratt.
John Surratt. He actually escaped to Canada and later escaped to Europe. So he didn't get caught initially. He got away. He escaped, he got away and escaped to Canada, and he eventually ended up in Europe. Well, they caught him in Europe in 1867. And they retried him in the United States.
Did we just have troops everywhere?
They caught him in 1867 in Europe.
We just had like troops.
Just
everywhere.
caught him, he was still
Somewhere in
wanted.
No.
And somebody must have fingered him, and so there he is. Okay, so, you guys are pitiful. I should have known not to say that. So Surratt was captured abroad, and he was tried in 1867. Okay, he was tried. Now, what is that? We still have to have a result, right? Well, actually, you know what a hung jury is? It's when the jury can't unanimously say you're guilty. Well, they had a hung jury, and he actually was released and set free. So he was tried, John Surratt was tried. The jury couldn't decide beyond a reasonable doubt, unanimously, that he was guilty. So that's called a hung jury. And then when you have a hung jury and you can't decide, the person goes free. So he actually was set free. Okay? Now, what happened to Mudd and Samuel Arnold and O'Loughlin? They did get a life sentence. President Andrew Johnson in 1869 pardoned Mudd and Arnold. Pardoned them. Let them go. Pardoned them. 1869. So Dr. Mudd and Samuel Arnold were pardoned because, as Garrett said, I think now President Johnson said, well, maybe he was just doing his job. I mean, you don't know. It was controversial. So he pardoned those two guys in 1869 because Samuel Arnold really never had a huge part of it. He was just kind of part of the group. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, Michael O'Loughlin was not pardoned, and he died in prison.
At what age?
I don't know, that's a good question.
You know, where in Europe now? 86.
You'd probably find
No
out.
way.
145.
if I was him, I'd just stay
Still
in
alive.
Canada.
No way.
No one's gonna come to Canada to find him. It's too cold.
Okay, yes.
Why was Laughlin not part of it?
I think Johnson thought he had more to do with it, you know, there was some, I'm gonna show you a video tomorrow. Is tomorrow Thursday?
Yeah.
I'll show you a little video tomorrow that talks a little bit about, a little bit of controversy over this, and then we're gonna watch The Conspirator after we take our test next week. You'll like it. Okay, now, I gotta finish up because our last subtopic is the South's reaction to the assassination. What was the reaction of Southerners to the assassination of Lincoln? You would think that they would be thrilled, and we'll see how that works out. So the South's reaction to the assassination. Now, really to the surprise of many, most Southerners were shocked and saddened with Lincoln's death. You remember Confederate General Joe Johnston? Remember the name? This is how he summed up Lincoln's assassination. He said, quote, "We have lost our best friend." That was Albert Johnston's, or did I-
Joe Johnson.
Joe Johnston's summation of Lincoln's death. They lost their best friend. Why did he say that if he was a Southerner? Because think about what we talked about. Was Lincoln going to be harsh or fairly easy on the South after their disloyal actions? He was really going to be easy. And he knew that the people that replaced Lincoln, especially maybe those radical Republicans, if they could influence Andrew Johnson to stick it to the South, by God, they were worried about that. So the South thought they lost their best friend because Lincoln's plan for the South was much more generous than others, such as radical Republicans that might gain control when Andrew Johnson became president. Okay? And we're going to see Johnson has a huge struggle with the radical Republicans that led to impeachment. Okay? We had our first presidential impeachment and impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. Okay? We'll talk about that. Okay? Now, after Lincoln's death, I want you to write this down. After Lincoln's death, the South was treated more like a conquered country by Northerners than anything else. After Lincoln's death, the South was treated more like a conquered country by the North than anything else. One more time. After Lincoln's death, the South was treated more like a conquered country by the North than anything else. So the truth of the matter is, and giving you a little prelude to next test material, is the radical Republicans are going to go after Johnson because Johnson's going to continue Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, and it's going to lead to an impeachment trial where they try to throw him out of office. Okay? Now, for those newbies here, I'll tell you how this works. Tomorrow, we are going to watch this video that I want to show you, okay? Now, I don't like to give exams on Mondays because you come off the weekend and I don't get good results, and I'll just make the other people hear this again. The purpose behind me giving you an exam is to find out if you learned anything I taught you. Well, if I give that on Monday and you don't study very much on the weekend, which is probably what high school kids are going to do, then I'm not going to get very good information on how much you learned. So what we're going to do is we'll watch the video tomorrow. If we have time, I'll give you the review tomorrow. I'll always give you a review before the test, and there won't be ever anything on the test that's not on the review. If we don't have time tomorrow, I'll give you the review on Monday, okay? And then we'll have the test on Tuesday. So you can count on a test on here next Tuesday. Yeah.
When do we have to have a planning board vote?
Okay, by Tuesday morning. Yeah. Now, when we take a test for you newbies again, and I'll remind you this, we don't come here, we go straight to the Commons after lunch and take the test there. So tomorrow we're going to watch a video, possible review. Okay, Friday we're going to the gym. Monday we'll start The Conspirator, the movie I want to show you, unless I have to give you the review, and then I'll give you the review and then start the movie. We'll have the test Tuesday, we'll continue the movie after the test, and we'll just continue the movie the rest of next week, and then we'll move into the next test material. That's the plan. Yeah?
Lee Harvey Oswald died.
Lee Harvey Oswald was being, and it's ironic you say that because
I guess, isn't there a lot of stuff like Lincoln and Kennedy, like a lot of stuff?
well, yeah, there's some
Conspiracy.
interesting things.